With India's demographic transition, come challenges. The demographic dividend is smaller, but will last longer due to regional variation in the onset of fertility decline. As southern states struggle with the growing burden of supporting the elderly, northern states will supply the workforce needed for growth. Between 2015 to 2016 and 2019 to 2020, UP's TFR has declined from 2.7 to 2.4, while Bihar's TFR has declined from 3.4 to 3.0. Success brings its challenges. The first challenge is accepting the win, the second is to learn to live with it. Recent results from National Family Health Survey 5, NFHS 5, suggest that we are entering an era where we will have to tackle these challenges. NFHS 5 places the total fertility rate, TFR, at 2.0. With two parents having two children, we have reached a replacement level of fertility. Due to many young people, the population will continue to grow, but the replacement level fertility is a significant milestone in India's demographic history. This decline is spread evenly across the country, with 29 states and UTs having a TFR of 1.9 or less, with 7 below 1.6. All southern states have a TFR of 1.7 to 1.8, similar to that of Sweden. Even states that have not reached replacement fertility, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, seem to be headed in that direction. Between 2015 to 2016 and 2019 to 2020, UP's TFR has declined from 2.7 to 2.4, while Bihar's TFR has declined from 3.4 to 3.0. Part of the original coterie of lagging states, Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan both have achieved TFRs of 2.0. This success, however, brings its challenge. As fertility declines, the proportion of the older population grows, and societies face the challenge of supporting an aging population with a shrinking workforce. This challenge is greater for leaders at the beginning of the demographic transition, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. According to the National Statistical Office, while the proportion of population greater than age 60 was 8.6% for India as a whole in 2011, it was 12.6% for Kerala and 10.4% for Tamil Nadu, projected to increase further to 20.9% and 18.2% respectively by 2031. Interestingly, these are also among the more prosperous states in India, whose economic activities increasingly rely on migrant labor from other states. With a paucity of data on migration, it is not easy to estimate the dependence on migrant workers, but the COVID crisis and mass return migration of interstate workers suggest that many industries, such as auto parts manufacturing and construction in southern states, rely on semi-skilled migrants, often transported under contractual arrangements, from northern and eastern states, particularly Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Odisha. With aging states increasingly relying on a workforce from relatively younger states to maintain their economic prosperity, it may be time for us to change our mindset about critical dimensions of India's federalism. Concern with population growth and a desire to not reward non-performing states have shaped interstate relations in India over the past decades, shaping the allocation of political power and central resources devolved to states. While the Indian Constitution mandates allocation of Lok Sabha seats across states in proportion to their population via the Delimitation Commission, the emergency-era 42nd Amendment froze seat allocation to the population share of states in the 1971 census. This freeze, originally expected to end in 2001, was further extended until after the 2031 census by the 84th Amendment. This has led to a much greater population per constituency in northern states than in southern states. In 2011, Uttar Pradesh had an average of 25 lakh persons per constituency, while Tamil Nadu had 18.5 lakh. The division of central allocation to states is another area where population concerns have dominated equity considerations. Much of the center-state revenue sharing occurs through recommendations of various finance commissions. The 6th to 14th finance commissions allocated resources between states using the 1971 population shares of various states. The 15th Finance Commission used census data from 2011, but it also added the criteria of demographic performance, rewarding states with lower TFR. In view of sustained fertility decline in all states and the overall attainment of replacement level fertility nationally, should a focus on demographic performance continue to trump principles of equity? The answer depends on our view of India's demographic future. Does India want to pursue China's route of sharply lower fertility, with a large number of families stopping at one child, or are we content with moderately below replacement fertility of about 1.7 to 1.8? If the latter, we are well positioned to head in this direction. Little needs to be done beyond improving the quality of family planning services for couples already desirous of small families. In our opinion, trying to aim for a very low fertility of TFR below 1.5 will be a mistake. As China's experience shows, while very low fertility provides a temporary demographic dividend, with a reduced number of dependents to workers, the increased burden of caring for the elderly may become overwhelming over the long term. India is fortunate that its demographic dividend may be smaller, but is likely to last for a more extended period due to regional variation in the onset of the fertility decline. As southern states struggle with the growing burden of supporting the elderly, northern states will supply the workforce needed for economic growth. The increasing pace of migration may help shore up economic expansion in the south, with its shrinking workforce augmented by workers from other states. If we choose to follow this path of moderate fertility decline coupled with interstate sharing of demographic dividend, there is little justification for continuing to punish states that entered the demographic transition later. The 16th Finance Commission and the next Delimitation Commission must be freed from the burden of managing the demographic transition, focused on carrying out their tasks in the best interests of Indian federalism. India's electric vehicle push will lead to brighter, greener future. It is in line with the country's climate change commitments, will help boost manufacturing sector, and also help ensure energy security. The transition to electric mobility is a promising global strategy for decarbonizing the transport sector. India is the fifth largest car market in the world and has the potential to become one of the top three in the near future, with about 40 crore customers in need of mobility solutions by the year 2030. That is one side of the coin. The other side is that the country needs a transportation revolution. The current trajectory of adding ever more cars running on expensive imported fuel and cluttering up already overcrowded cities suffering from infrastructure bottlenecks and intense air pollution is unfeasible. India's cities will choke. A transportation revolution will have many components: better walkability, public transportation, railways, roads, and better cars. Many of these better cars will likely be electric. The transition to electric mobility is a promising global strategy for decarbonizing the transport sector. India is among a handful of countries that supports the global EV 30 at 30 campaign, which aims for at least 30% new vehicle sales to be electric by 2030. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's advocacy of 5 elements for climate change, Panchamrit, at the recently concluded COP26 in Glasgow is a commitment to the same. The PM espoused various ideas, like renewable energy catering to 50% of India's energy needs, reducing carbon emission by 1 billion tons by 2030, and achieving net zero by 2070, so that future generations can lead secure and prosperous lives. The push for EVs is driven by the global climate agenda established under the Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emissions in order to limit global warming. It is also projected to contribute in improving the overall energy security situation as the country imports over 80% of its overall crude oil requirements, amounting to approximately $100 billion. The push is also expected to play an important role in the local EV manufacturing industry for job creation. Additionally, through several grid support services, EVs are expected to strengthen the grid and help accommodate higher renewable energy penetration while maintaining secure and stable grid operation. The global electric mobility revolution is today defined by the rapid growth in electric vehicle (EV) uptake. It is estimated that 2 in every 100 cars sold today are powered by electricity. This phenomenon is today defined by the rapid growth in EV uptake, with EV sales for the year 2020 reaching 2.1 million. The global EV fleet totaled 8.0 million in 2020, with EVs accounting for 1% of the global vehicle stock and 2.6% of global car sales. Falling battery costs and rising performance efficiencies are fueling the demand for EVs globally. It is estimated that by 2020-30 India's cumulative demand for batteries would be approximately 900 to 1,100 GWh, but there is concern over the absence of a manufacturing base for batteries in India, leading to sole reliance on imports to meet rising demand. As per government data, India imported more than $1 billion worth of lithium-ion cells in 2021, even though there is negligible penetration of electric vehicles and battery storage in the power sector. While India is yet to grab the opportunity, global manufacturers are betting high on battery manufacturing and fast moving from gigafactories to terafactories. With recent technology disruptions, battery storage has great opportunity in promoting sustainable development in the country, considering government initiatives to promote e-mobility and renewable power, 450 gigawatts energy capacity target by 2030. With rising levels of per capita income, there has been a tremendous demand for consumer electronics in the areas of mobile phones, UPS, laptops, power banks, etc. that require advanced chemistry batteries. This makes manufacturing of advanced batteries one of the largest economic opportunities of the 21st century. The Government of India has taken various measures to develop and promote the EV ecosystem in the country, ranging from the remodel faster adoption and manufacturing of electric vehicles, FAME 2 scheme, 10,000 crore rupees, for the consumer side to production-linked incentive, PLI, scheme for advanced chemistry cell, ACC, 18,100 crore rupees, for the supplier side, and finally the recently launched PLI scheme for auto and automotive components, 25,938 crore rupees, for manufacturers of electric vehicles. Thus, all these forward and backward integration mechanisms in the economy are expected to achieve robust growth in the coming years and will enable India to leapfrog to the environmentally cleaner electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. This will not only help the nation conserve foreign exchange, but also make India a global leader in manufacturing of EVs and better comply with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. All three schemes cumulatively expect an investment of about 1 lakh crore rupees, which will boost domestic manufacturing and also facilitate EVs and battery demand creation along with the development of a complete domestic supply chain and foreign direct investment in the country. The program envisages an oil import bill reduction of about 2 lakh rupees crore and import bill substitution of about 1.5 lakh rupees crore. I hope the PM's vision will push both the public agencies and private entrepreneurs to embark on a collaborative journey that will benefit the country. Barbados, by the people. The Caribbean nation, 55 years after its independence, has become a republic. Barbados was a part of the British Empire for over 400 years, a link in the lines of trade, commerce and oppression that English mercantilism and colonialism fostered for centuries. On Tuesday, at the stroke of the midnight hour, the Republic of Barbados was born. The Caribbean island nation, 55 years after its independence, got rid of the remnants of colonial rule by separating from Britain. Queen Elizabeth is no longer the head of state. In one sense, being a part of the British Empire, as Canada, Australia and 15 other realms continue to be, was merely a symbolic vestige of colonialism. But some symbols carry in them the memories and structures of violence and inequality, and are examples of how the world order continues to be determined by them. Barbados was a part of the British Empire for over 400 years, a link in the lines of trade, commerce and oppression that English mercantilism and colonialism fostered for centuries. Slaves, indentured labor, a lack of democracy, the Caribbean was home to some of the most institutionalized and invisibilized horrors in history. Today, the new republic faces an economic crisis because of supply lines being disrupted thanks to the pandemic. Meanwhile, the countries that ravaged the economies of their colonies have continued to prosper, in no small part thanks to that wealth. But the declaration of a republic is more than repudiation. It is an acknowledgement, as the country's first president, Sandra Mason put it, that we the people are Barbados. And the fact that Charles Windsor, next in line for the British throne, attended and supported the celebration in Barbados is a sign, hopefully, that the old hearts may be a thing of the past. However, for many in the Caribbean, including in Barbados and beyond, the inequalities of the colonial past continue to determine their present. The British royal family, for example, made a substantial amount of money from the slave trade. The demand for reparations is based on that reality.